Welcome to the Painting Coach, and this video is a hot one. That's right, we're painting Fuegan, the Phoenix Lord of the Fire Dragons. A huge thank you to Games Workshop for sending me this model ahead of time so I can create this video for you. Now, there's a lot of detail on here, but I love bright orange, so let's get painting. Now, the first thing I've done is leave the head separate, and I've primed the body and banner in Wraithbone, and I've primed the head with Mephiston Red spray. Now, if you haven't got the spray, you can just use Mephiston Red from the pot over black. The most distinctive part on Fuegan, and indeed all the fire dragons, is the bright orange armor. So to this end, I'm going to take Magmadroth Flame contrast paint and paint this all over the parts that I want to be orange. That includes things on the banner and the body of Fuegan himself. Now, you'll notice on Fuegan that he has got some dark red armor panels. We'll cover those up later, so if you do spill any Magmadroth Flame on them, it's absolutely fine. You can just carry on. Just be careful around the bits you want to stay bright, like those parchments on his waist. Once that's completely dry, I want to add a little bit of shading just to take the shadows towards the red side. So to do this, I'm using some Blood Angels Red contrast paint, but I have thinned it 2 parts contrast medium to 1 part Blood Angels Red, so it's very, very thin. And what I'm looking to do is to paint this into all the recesses. Now, if you want to, you can just paint this all over the armor and let it settle, but I'm just being a little more deliberate with where I put it, so it just makes it a bit easier to clean up later on. But if you do make any spillages or you do put too much of a blotch on, don't worry, because we will paint over it. The only thing to be really careful is that it doesn't pull too heavily. Once that's all dry, we'll move on and start painting the darker red elements. So for this, we're using Khorne Red. Now, there are quite a few darker elements. So those armor inserts I talked about earlier, we're going to paint those. We've obviously got the cloth, the loin cloth coming down from his waist. And we have that stripe down the middle of the back banner as well. So if there's anything you're not sure of, just check the box art and that'll show you where these dark red elements are. I'm now going to shade all of the dark red, and I'm not using Null Oil because I don't really like how it works in this instance, so I'm going to use Dark Tone from Army Painter Fanatic. You can absolutely use Null Oil if that's all you've got. You just will need to put a second coat on, and I'm being very careful with this. The main thing with this is that you don't spill it on any of the orange that you've already painted. Once that's dry, it's time to highlight back up all of the dark red. Now, we're going to do this in 2 different ways. So we're going to take the softer material dark red and we're going to take the hard armor panels. So regardless of which bit you're painting, the first thing is to go back to Khorne Red and start to highlight up the armor and the soft cloth, leaving the darker color in the recesses. So just take your time with this. If you're not entirely sure about what this looks like, just check the box art because it does give you quite a good example of how the shadows all lie. Focusing on the softer parts such as the loincloth on the back banner, we're now going to use Wazdakka Red to highlight it up. And what we're looking to do here is just catch the top of the creases and the folds. So we don't want to use a huge amount of this. We are going to keep this fairly thin, but we don't want to worry if we do go on a little bit too thick. We can always use some Khorne Red to tidy it up if we need to. The final highlight on the material red is going to be with Squig Orange. Now, this is a nice desaturated orangey red colour, and we're looking to just pick up the absolute sharpest creases here. So you can use this very sparingly, and we want to keep it inside the Wazdakka Red from the previous stage. So just take your time with this. Moving on to the harder armor panels, the color we're going to use for this is Mephiston Red. So the first thing to do is to just drag your brush along those sharp edges and get a nice crisp line. Now, this is going to be quite a bit brighter than the Khorne Red underneath, but that's fine because we want it to stand out a little bit on the armor. Next up, we'll use some Evil Sunz Scarlet, which is a nice bright red. And again, we're looking to paint this inside the Mephiston Red from the previous step. Now, on some of these panels, it'll be easy to just drag your brush and get a nice crisp highlight. On others, you're just going to need to be a little bit more careful and paint it inside. So just take your time with this. Again, any mistakes can easily be tidied up. The final highlight that we're going to put onto all of those hard armor panels is going to be with Wild Rider Red. Now, this is a nice orangey red, and we're going to use this fairly sparingly. So we're just going to put some dots along here just to show where the armor is sharpest and is catching the most light. So just take your time and work your way across all of the model. With the armor and the cloth finished, it's now time to do some of the leather. So we're going to do a brown leather color. There's not a huge amount of this, but just be careful around the orange you've already finished. I'm going to base all of it using Dryad bark. So you've got that belt going across the chest area, and you've got the pouch and the belt holding the grenades on the left leg and around the back. The first highlight is a 50-50 mix of Gawthor Brown and Dryad Bark, and essentially what we're looking to do here is drag the brush along those sharp edges. So just take your time with this. It's a nice easy highlight to do, leaving the Dryad Bark in the recesses. The final highlight we'll do is with pure Gawthor Brown, and again this is a very easy step. You're just dragging your brush along the sharpest parts of the model to get that really nice crisp highlight. Now because we've used 2 colours but 3 steps, it should just be a fairly gradual highlight. If you want something a bit brighter, then you could pop a little bit of Corax Stone on the end, but I'm quite happy with this because it's not a significant part of the model. Next up, we'll base all of the black elements. Now, this is a really important step, but it's also a dangerous step when it comes to that orange armor. So the color I'm using for this is AK Black. If you've got something like Abaddon Black, that's absolutely fine. Just take your time, block in all of those elements that are going to be black. So we've got that lance, we've got the axe, we've got the tubing, the pipes and things like that. So if you're not sure, again, check the box art. Just be really careful around the orange armor, because if you do need to fix it, it will just be a little bit of a drawn out process. So just get all of that done and then we'll come back and highlight it. The first highlight we're going to pop on all of the black is with Eshin Grey. Now this is a very dark grey, and what I'm looking to do here is just drag my brush along where I can, and if I can't, I'm just going to very carefully paint in some of the highlights, particularly on the things like those gem shaped elements. Now this isn't so much an edge highlight as more of a kind of an area highlight, a volumetric highlight. So I'm using quite a bit of Eshin Grey. It doesn't cover particularly well, which means when it dries, it will blend down into the black a bit as well. So it does just give a little bit of subtlety to it. Now don't forget to use this across all the elements that are black. So you can see them on the model here as I'm working across it, and also check the box art if you're not sure. The last highlight I'm going to use is Dawnstone, and the key for this is keeping it inside the Eshin Grey from the previous step. Now I'm going to be a bit more deliberate with how I apply the Dawnstone as well, so this is going to be much more of an edge highlight, but I am making sure that I do keep it inside the Eshin Grey, so you do get that nice gradual highlight. It's important not to have too much on your brush and to have a really good tip as well. So again, we're being really careful not to get this on any of the elements we've already finished. Now, there's not a huge amount of silver on the model. In fact, it's only really the axe head and the clips on the grenade on the belt. So I'm going to take some dark aluminium from Vallejo, and I'm going to use this to paint that very carefully around the areas we've already finished, such as the orange armor and the black on the handle of the axe as well. When that's completely dry, I'm going to go back to dark tone from Army Painter. If you haven't got dark tone, again, null oil is fine. Just use 2 coats of it and cover all of the silver. To highlight it up, I'm going to use some chrome from Vallejo Model Air, and I'm just going to drag this along the edges to get a nice crisp highlight. I've noticed in some areas I put it on a little bit too thick, but that's really easy to fix with just a little bit of dark aluminium. Next up, we'll base all of the gold elements, and quite fittingly, I'm using Dragon's Gold from 2 thin coats. Now, if you haven't got this, Retributor Armor from Citadel's absolutely fine. Now, there is quite a bit of gold around areas we've already finished, and also around areas we don't really want to spill anything on. So we've got that big dragon icon across his waist. That's a heck of a belt buckle. We've also got little elements across the model as well, such as the gem holders. We've got the icon on the top of the back banner. So just work your way around very carefully, particularly around areas you've already finished. I'm then going to shade all of the gold using Reikland Fleshade. Now this is again a nice easy step where you're just painting over the same areas and it'll flow nicely into the recesses. Again, just be careful around bits that you have already finished. We'll highlight all of the gold using Glistening Gold from 2 thin coats. Again, if you haven't got this and you've got Liberator Gold from Citadel, that's absolutely fine and will work perfectly well in this instance. So just carry on doing this, catching all the sharp bits of the model, being careful not to put it on too thickly because it will look a little bit blotchy if you do that, and just generally drag it along those sharp edges. An optional step just to make that gold really pop is to use some white gold from Pro Acryl. Now, if you haven't got this, mix a tiny little of that chrome into your bright gold color, not too much at all. And I'm just using this to dot and dab across those parts of the model that I think are going to catch the absolute most light. I'm going to tidy up the scrolls that we've got coming from the belt buckle next, and the color I'm using for this is Screaming Skull. Now, this is a very bright color. So depending on how careful you've been, you could get this done in 1 coat, or if you're like me and haven't been particularly careful, it did take me 3 coats just to completely cover up some of the spillages I'd made on it. But just take your time, let it dry, don't put it on too thickly and get a nice smooth coverage. There's also a little bit of tassel on the back of the axe. When that's dry, I'm going to take a little bit of Seraphim Sepia and just shade a little bit towards the top where you've got a little bit of a fold into it. If you put too much on, don't worry, you can always just go back in and fix it using the Screaming Skull from the previous step. Before I highlight, I'm going to paint in the icons that we've got on those little bits of material. Now, they're fairly basic. It's basically 2 lines and either side of a flame icon. So I'm just going to freehand this in using Khorne Red. This is entirely optional. You don't have to do this. You can just watch through this little bit of the video that has how I do it. And then if you need to, you can always go back in with that Screaming Skull to tidy it all up. The final highlight across those areas is going to be with Screaming Skull. These don't need to be too bright. I just want to make sure that I'm able to highlight where we've got that Seraphim Sepia. If you want to add a little bit of white towards the bottom to highlight them, then feel free. So we're making really good progress. It's time to do that iconic orange armor. So how are we going to do it? Very simply. We're going to take some Troll Slayer Orange, and we're going to work our way across all of the armor, leaving the darker colors in the recesses. So areas I'm particularly focusing on are parts that are very, very visible, so such as the legs, the tops of the shoulder pads, the chest, the arms, and the hands. The bodysuit underneath, I'm not worrying about that too much. And the reason I'm not worrying about that too much is because it's actually in a bit of a shadow area. So I don't really want to waste time going in and covering that up with the Troll Slayer Orange. But we are painting a big amount of the armor. So this is probably going to be the most time consuming part. Keep your paint thin and go back in with a second layer rather than trying to put it on too thick. When that's done, we're then going to go back in with the aptly named Fire Dragon Bright and start to edge highlight. And this is where you're going to start to see the armor really come alive and really start to pop. So whereas we were covering the majority of the model in the previous step, with this, we're just doing the edges of the armor. So drag your brush along them to get nice crisp highlights. Take your time. If you're not sure, check the box art because it's a very good reference as to where those bright highlights are. But generally, this should be fairly nice and straightforward. And actually, for me, this was the most enjoyable part of the model because I really started to see it coming alive. Now, I want my orange to be nice and saturated, nice and vivid. So for the final highlight, I'm using Yriel Yellow. And again, what I'm doing is dragging this along the sharpest edges of the model, really focusing on the parts that are going to catch the most light. And I'm making sure I'm keeping it inside the Fire Dragon Bright from the previous step. If you wanted to go for a slightly more desaturated orange, maybe something a little bit like the Fire Dragon box, you could use Lugganath Orange here rather than Yriel Yellow, but I like the really punchy colour that this gives me. So we'll do Fuegan's face mask next, and the colour I'm using for this is Corax White. I'm not being particularly tidy, but I am just taking my time so it doesn't go on too thickly. So it does take 2 or 3 coats of this. I'm also going to paint all of the gems with Corax White as well. To shade the face mask, I'm using Berserker Bloodshade. I'm just working this into the recesses. I'm not letting it pool, I'm just letting it flow in there nicely. And if I do put too much on, I'm absorbing it with a brush. Next up, I'm going to go in with AK White and start to highlight the face mask. Now I'm going to highlight the majority of the face mask, just leaving that Berserker Bloodshade in the recesses. And I'm also going to use this to highlight all of the gems across Fuegan as well. To paint the eyes, I'm going to take a little bit of Troll Slayer Orange and just carefully layer this into where it needs to go. If you do spill it, you can just tidy it up with some AK White. As a final highlight, I'm just going to put a dot of Yriel Yellow in the eyes, and that's just going to give me a little bit of an orange glow. Now, there's a little bit of a gradient on Fuegan's helmet, so I'm going to show you how to do this very quickly. First up, tidy up anything you need to with Mephiston Red, and then I'm going to take that dark tone from Army Painter and I'm going to shade all across the helmet, apart from that centre bit, but I am going to shade around the gold elements. When that's completely dry, I'm then going to take some very thin Mephiston Red. Now, the key to this is that you dab your brush on a paper towel so it absorbs all the moisture from it, and then you can just glaze it. And what I'm looking to do is from about halfway up of the crest, I'm just looking to drag that back towards the very darkest recess. Now, I'm not going into the recess, I'm just dragging towards it. Let it dry before you do the second part, and this should start to build up nicely. I'm then going to do the same thing, but in the opposite direction with Khorne Red. So again, it's very thin. It's probably 2 to 3 parts water to 1 part paint, but I'm dabbing my brush onto a paper towel before I go to the model, and I'm using quite a big brush so I can cover quite a big area in one. So just brush this to where you want it to be darkest, which for me is right at the top. And this gives me, again, a nice gradient. So if you're not sure how to do this, just practice it a little bit. You're using very thin paint. So if you just want to paint over and have a solid color, you can do that as well. The last step on the helmet, again, is doing exactly the same. It's using a glaze, but this is 1 part Abaddon Black to 1 part Khorne Red. Again, very thin. Tap your brush on a paper towel and just drag this into those areas that are darkest. And if you're not sure, just look at the box art. It's really clear. Just drag them in very nicely. And if you've got a little bit of a ropey blend like I have in some places, it's okay. You can stipple over it, or you can do more glazes. It's entirely up to you how much work you put into this. Once you're happy with that blend, let's highlight everything back up. So the first color we're going to use is Evil Sunz Scarlet. Now for the helmet, this is nice and easy because we've got some nice sharp edges. We're just going to drag our brush along them, and this is going to give us a very nice crisp red highlight. When you're highlighting around the face mask, just be careful around that white. So take your time and just apply a little bit of paint. You can always go back in with more later on. The final highlight is going to be with Wild Rider Red, and this is that nice orangey red. So we're going to use this fairly sparingly, only mainly towards the top. And we're going to make sure we keep it inside the Evil Sunz Scarlet from the previous step, because that's just going to help maintain the brightness and the colour. So make sure you haven't got too much on your brush, a good tip, and just drag it along those edges, and you'll get a nice crisp highlight. For all the gems, I'm going to use some Kroxigor Scales, so I'm going to apply this very carefully. And how I'm going to do it is basically paint the gem with the Kroxigor Scale, and when it's dry, I'm just going to paint the bottom half of the gem with more Kroxigor Scale, and then put a little dot of white in the top. And this is going to give me a really nice, easy gem effect. We've still got the back banner to do, but most of it is painted using the same colours I've already used on the model. I just wanted to very quickly show you how I painted some of the raised details. So for the Fire Dragon rune, I'm just using AK White and dragging my brush along the sculpted detail. This gives me a really nice crisp highlight. I'm also going to use this on the chain as well. And for the non-metallic gold on the chain, I'm just going to take some Nazdreg Yellow and paint it over those elements. And when it's dry, I'm going to put a little bit more Nazdreg Yellow just where I want to have that shadow. And there we have it. Fuegan is done, ready to lead his fire dragons into battle. I'm really happy with how this model has turned out, despite it being quite complex and quite challenging in some areas. I really love how bright and popping the orange is, and I think it's going to look great on the tabletop. I can't wait to paint some of the other fire warriors. So thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked it, leave that like and a comment down below. I'll see you next time.